Now, there's a lot of obscure computers out there in the world, especially if you were an American. During the 70s, 80s, and 1990s, while we sat around with the holy digital trinity of IBM, Commodore, and Apple, what about them? I rest my case.
While we were sitting around in America with the digital trinity, the rest of the world was doing other things with other computers of varying levels of, well, awesomeness. For instance, the UK had its own run of computers with things like the BBC Micro, the Archimedes Acord, the Amstrad CPC and its variants, and most importantly in the minds of many from that region, the Sinclair Spectrum. Mainland Europe was huge into Commodore 64s and Ataris where they were available, particularly Germany and France, maintaining the entire continent's position as people who wished they were Americans but couldn't master the fine art of being complete gun-toting, Bible-thumping assholes to the entire free civilized world. And let's not forget Japan. In the early 1980s, as much as they were a technical powerhouse in many, many areas, with monolithical companies such as Sony, NEC, and Panasonic dominating the landscape internationally, making huge inroads into fields like high-quality television, portable music, and video games, they hadn't gone very far into the field of personal computing yet.
That isn't to say they hadn't tried, no, but you'll be hard-pressed to find a solid example of a Japanese personal computer much before 1985 that made any sort of noticeable impact. While the Americans were gallivanting about with their pretty little Macintoshes and their workaholic IBM personal computers. Yeah. And even that upstart Commodore, wherever Commodore happened to be, I don't really know. Japan kind of sat there.
Enter the man standing on the left in this photo with a very young Bill Gates, Kazuhiko Nishi. In 1983, Nishi was an executive employed by Microsoft Japan. I have no idea exactly what Microsoft Japan did in the 1980s, but that's not the point. Nishi had an idea on how to revolutionize Japanese personal computing based on actually something that the Americans had already come up with. Nishi was intrigued by recent innovations in home electronics, and in particular the unparalleled success of the VCR, and in particular, even there, the VHS standard. Why, he pondered, can we not push computers in the same direction? A single unified standard across various manufacturers with a product that's always compatible with every other version of itself. It would make life easy for consumers by removing the uncertainty of multiple system profiles with various capabilities. Software designers would be able to push product to a large audience without having to deal with ports to all sorts of different hardware. Manufacturing would be pretty simple for everyone involved by using off-the-shelf parts all the way around. Bear in mind that by the time the MSX got to full swing in Japan, Apple had already put 4 machines out on the market, while IBM had gone through 11 separate revisions of their hardware, all of which worked hard at making the last version you paid several $1,000s for completely obsolete. On the flip side, in 1986, Commodore was sitting happily on their market share with 1 or 2 single machines on the market, the Commodore 64 and the newer Commodore 128. They were the only company that made them, though, as the so-called clone market was still a foreign concept to American manufacturers at this point, and Japan was not happy with the concept of a single manufacturer having control over every aspect of a product.
It's not well established why, if for any particular reason at all, Commodore or IBM never made any progress selling to the Japanese market, or even if they tried. It may well have been the incompatibility between American and Japanese markets, issues with management, or even cost. The IBM XT, for instance, was a bloody expensive piece of machinery early in 1986, with the current model costing well over $8,000, and it was far from anything you would consider user-friendly or pretty. It ran early versions of DOS or maybe CP/M at that point, which were about as approachable as Wolverines with AIDS.
So back to Nishi in 1983. He concluded, and accurately, that the best way to produce a popular and cost-effective personal computer that the masses would be happy to use would be to fix the standard much like VHS had done for videocassettes a few years before. And that's exactly what he did, and thus was born the MSX, or Microsoft... something. So out came the first few MSX models in 1983. Lots of companies got into this game. Sony, Sanyo, and then some, all producing different and mostly cosmetic variations on the same basic hardware specification, appropriately called MSX, or later MSX1. An MSX unit, by and large, always had mostly the same internal specifications. Most games were cartridge-based in the beginning, and many units had 2 cartridge slots, with things like save cartridges or game cheat devices intended for slot 2. Some games could actually react to what you had inserted into the other slot and would unlock content, play differently, or any number of Easter eggs.
There's a few games on cassette tape as well, but that format fell away pretty quickly, unlike it did in the United States. The whole thing wasn't without its problems either. The system was sluggish because of the very small-scale processor, there wasn't a lot of RAM, and cartridges had a very tiny capacity, something that was fixed eventually by an add-on floppy drive, which brought in quite a bit more storage space and speed to the system. Most of all, the video, however, was really nothing to write home about.
256 by 192 doesn't sound like a lot, and it really isn't. Games had to be fairly compressed to fit on screen, which made some ports look like, well, ports. The MSX1 wasn't all that great at scrolling either, so some games actually removed it entirely when it was reasonable. But if it wasn't, well, take for example Gradius. The MSX originally was incapable of scrolling less than 8 pixels at a time. On a screen only 192 pixels wide, that means 1/24 of the screen is moving every single line. That may not seem like a lot when you think about it in terms of a percentage, but that's usually at least half an inch or more on a smaller display. So the designers went back to the drawing board to revise the specification a little bit and make it a touch more robust. The MSX2 specification, released in 1986, changed up the internals a little bit for the better. While the CPU was still the same, that wee little Zlog Z80, the system now featured an advanced MSX BASIC, support for integrated 3.5-inch floppy drives, 64 kilobytes of RAM at the bottom level with room for up to 512 kilobytes, and in particular a specially designed new Yamaha MSX Video VDP. The MSX2 really is an excellent machine for its era. The only catch was that while software for the MSX1 would work on the MSX2, backward compatibility if you will, MSX2 software had no way to work on the MSX1 because of the additional hardware. It's really a small price to pay all in all. Following the MSX2, there were 2 more major revisions. The 2 Plus, which introduced support for processors up to 5.3 MHz, an even better VDP, and an upgraded sound chip, and in 1990, the final specification, the Turbo R. The Turbo R really is the powerhouse Superman of the entire MSX family, running both the old 3.5 MHz processor for backwards compatibility and a new R800 processor that did 7 full MHz, which is pretty fast for 1990. It also featured a bunch of other features that made it the big granddaddy of the system, and it's one that everybody really wanted. The MSX was in active production in Japan until about 1995, when the system finally lost its edge to the newer PC-98 format, which not only was much more scalable and capable, but also ran Microsoft's Windows operating system, enabling it to be the equivalent with just about everything the West had at the time.
Now you may be asking, after all that history, why should you care about it, and what exactly does the MSX bring to the table for you, the gamer? Well, let me tell you right now, Jenny talks to the internet and expects it to give her back answers.
The MSX was the classic Japanese hobbyist computer, sort of like the Commodore was in the United States. It was standardized, approachable for developers, friendly to a point for its users, and all in all, people really liked it. A lot of companies cut their gums on this particular machine, with some games that still linger in our collective consciousness over 30 years later. Just a few examples include Squaresoft, Konami, Hudson Soft, Compile, Enix, Atlas, Falcom, and dozens more. There are hundreds of games for the system with classics galore that people still harp on.
What it did was it helped the Japanese game developers establish themselves, and it helped create a large portion of their industry as it stands today. But outside of its home region, it's largely forgotten. The Europeans had MSX1s for a period, but limited sales in that region kept the MSX2 from ever becoming much more than an expansion kit. And in Brazil, where the oddest of video gaming hardware has managed to take off and last for years, the MSX still has a large following.
And the machines aren't necessarily easy to come by if you're not Japanese, or in Japan. Places like eBay will get units in for auction now and again, but the prices are usually ridiculously inflated, like low-end MSX1 units going for over $200, or you have to deal with foreign sellers who are going to charge you outrageous shipping fees because of the weight of the unit. There are services online like Rinkia or Japan Auction Center which act like brokers for you and will purchase items from Japanese vendors who don't necessarily want to deal with the Americans directly, but there's a lot of additional fees involved, there's often tricky rules and policies, and you still have to wade through pages and pages of Japanese auctions trying to find exactly what you want while making sure that it's working, not badly damaged, and not a low-end unit, which is very difficult to do.
For example, this is a Wavy 32. It's one of Sanyo's MSX2 models. It sent me back about $150 all told to get it into the United States using a proxy service called Japan Auction Center. It took weeks to bid, to pay for, to discuss, to have packaged, to ship, to pick up. It had to go through customs. I had no direct contact with the seller because he spoke no English and didn't deal with Americans. I don't have the floppy drive for it either, and as of yet I've been completely unable to track down one, and since it uses a proprietary cartridge interface, I can't exactly just go out and grab something off the shelf and fudge it. As much as I would love to duct tape a solution together, it's not going to happen. Even if you can get one yourself, the fact that you're looking at a Japanese keyboard, a Japanese on-screen interface, Japanese text in your games, you're not going to get as much excitement out of this thing as you think you're going to. It's really not worth spending your money on. It's not American friendly. It was never meant to be, though. It's a Japanese system for the Japanese, so the fact that an American like myself has one just sort of says what an obsessive-compulsive, collecting, game-hoarding nerd I really am.
Thankfully, the system is very easy to emulate, and there's enough guides online to get you started. With the immense library of games, you're sure to find something you'll definitely like. To be honest, unless you're super hardcore or just dumb,
guess which one I am?
Going out and buying one isn't really in anyone's best interests. If you do manage to get one, you'll have to pay out the nose for anything that's worth having. Then you have to deal with the language barrier, the huge catalog of software that's poorly documented in English and will often leave you wondering exactly what it is you're looking at, the language barrier, the additional hardware requirements and peripherals like the add-on floppy drive for most of the MSX2 models, the language barrier, the fact that many of these systems are aging and not gracefully and beginning to decay. After all that, it's just not worth it.
And there you have it, the MSX computer in a very kanji-laden, Wikipedia-fed, geeky knowledge overload info-dumped nutshell. I hope you enjoyed it, because I certainly enjoyed blabbing on and on endlessly before our camera.